January 1971. Aspects of Hegel's philosophy. A historical occasion like the 125th anniversary of Hegel's death could have elicited what we call an appreciation. But that concept has become untenable, if indeed it ever had any value. It makes the impudent claim that because one has the dubious good fortune to live later, and because one has a professional interest in the person one is to talk about, one can sovereignly assign the dead person his place, thereby in some sense elevating oneself above him. This arrogance echoes in the loathsome question of what in Kant, and now Hegel as well, has any meaning for the present, and even the so-called Hegel Renaissance began half a century ago with a book by Benedetto Croce that undertook to distinguish between what was living and what was dead in Hegel. The converse question is not even raised: what the present means in the face of Hegel, whether perhaps the reason one imagines one has attained since Hegel's absolute reason has not in fact long since regressed behind the latter and accommodated to what merely exists, when Hegelian reason tried to set the burden of existence in motion through the reason that obtains even in what exists. All appreciations are subject to the judgment passed in Hegel's preface to the Phenomenology of Spirit on those who are above something only because they are not in it. Appreciations fail from the start to capture the seriousness and cogency of Hegel's philosophy by practicing on him what he called, with appropriate disdain, a philosophy of perspectives. If one does not want to miss Hegel with one's very first words, one must confront, however inadequately, the claim his philosophy makes to truth, rather than merely discussing his philosophy from above and thereby from below. Like other closed systems of thought, Hegel's philosophy avails itself of the dubious advantage of not having to allow any criticism whatsoever. All criticism of the details, according to Hegel, remains partial and misses the whole, which in any case takes this criticism into account. Conversely, criticizing the whole as a whole is abstract, unmediated, and ignores the fundamental motif of Hegelian philosophy, that it cannot be distilled into any maxim or general principle, and proves its worth only as a totality in the concrete interconnections of all its moments. Accordingly, the only way to honor Hegel is to refuse to allow oneself to be intimidated by the virtually mythological complexity of his critical method, which makes criticism seem false no matter what, and instead of graciously or ungraciously listing or denying his merits, go after the whole, which is what Hegel himself was after. These days, it is hardly possible for a theoretical idea of any scope to do justice to the experience of consciousness, and in fact not only the experience of consciousness, but the embodied experience of human beings, without having incorporated something of Hegel's philosophy. But this cannot be explained in terms of the trivial apokou, according to which Hegel, the absolute idealist, was a great realist and a man with a sharp historical eye. Hegel's substantive insights, which extended to the irreconcilability of the contradictions in bourgeois society, cannot be separated from speculation, the vulgar notion of which has nothing to do with the Hegelian notion, as though it were some kind of troublesome ornamentation. On the contrary, those insights are produced by speculation, and they lose their substance as soon as they are conceived as merely empirical. The idea that the a priori is also the a posteriori, an idea that was programmatic in Fichte and was then fully elaborated by Hegel, is not an audacious piece of bombast. It is the mainspring of Hegel's thought. It inspires both his criticism of a grim empirical reality and his critique of a static a priorism, where Hegel compels his material to speak, the idea of an original identity of subject and object in spirit, an identity that becomes divided and then reunites, is at work. Otherwise, the inexhaustibly rich content of his system would remain either a mere accumulation of facts and thus pre-philosophical, or merely dogmatic and without rigor. Richard Kroner rightly opposed describing the history of German idealism as advancing directly from Schelling to Hegel. Rather, Hegel resisted the dogmatic moment in Schelling's philosophy of nature through recourse to a Fichtean and even Kantian epistemological impulse. The dynamic of the phenomenology of spirit begins in epistemology and then goes on, of course, as the introduction already indicates, to explode the position of an isolated, or in Hegelian terms, abstract epistemology. Accordingly, the abundance of experiential concreteness, das Gegenstandliche, that is interpreted by thought in Hegel and nourishes thought in turn, is due not so much to a realistic frame of mind on Hegel's part as to his method of anamnesis, spirit's immersion in itself, or in Hegel's words, being's inwardization and self-possession, das in sich hineingehen, sich zusammensehen des Seins. If one tried to rescue the material substance of Hegelian philosophy from its allegedly outmoded and arbitrary speculation by eradicating its idealism, one would have nothing but positivism on the one hand and superficial intellectual history on the other. What Hegel thought, however, is also of a completely different order than that of embeddedness in relationships to which the individual disciplines closed their eyes. His system is not an overarching scientific system any more than it is an agglomeration of witty observations. When one studies his work, it sometimes seems as though the progress that spirit imagines itself to have made through clear methodology and ironclad empiricism, since Hegel's death and in opposition to him, is all a regression, while the philosophers who think they are maintaining something of Hegel's legacy have for the most part missed the concrete content on which Hegel's thought first proved itself. Think, for instance, of Gestalt theory, which Kohler expanded to a kind of philosophy. Hegel recognized the primacy of the whole over its finite parts, which are inadequate, and in their confrontation with the whole, contradictory. But he neither derived a metaphysics from the abstract principle of totality, nor glorified the whole as such in the name of the good Gestalt. He does not make the parts as elements of the whole autonomous in opposition to it. At the same time, as a critic of Romanticism, he knows that the whole realizes itself only in and through the parts, only through discontinuity, alienation, and reflection. Through, in short, everything that is anathema to Gestalt theory. If Hegel's whole exists at all, it is only as the quintessence of the partial moments, which always point beyond themselves and are generated from one another. It does not exist as something beyond them. This is what his category of totality is intended to convey. It is incompatible with any kind of tendency to harmony, no matter how much the late Hegel may subjectively have had such tendencies. His critical thought goes beyond both the stating of the unconnected and the principle of continuity. In him, connection is not a matter of unbroken transition, but a matter of sudden change, and the process takes place not through the moments approaching one another, but through rupture. Modern Gestalt theory, as interpreted by Max Scheler, challenges traditional epistemological subjectivism and interprets the chaotic material of the senses, the givenness of the phenomenon which the whole Kantian tradition had disqualified, as already specified and structured. Hegel, however, emphasized precisely this specification of the object, without in the process idolizing the sense certainty with the critique of which the phenomenology of spirit begins, to say nothing of intellectual intuition. It is precisely through absolute idealism, which permits nothing to remain outside the subject, now expanded to become infinite, but instead sweeps everything along with it into the current of immanence, that the opposition between mere matter and a consciousness that bestows form and meaning is extinguished. All later criticism of the so-called formalism of epistemology and ethics can be found explicitly formulated in Hegel, but he did not therefore leap with a bound into the allegedly concrete, as did Schelling before him and existential ontology today. One consequence of the unrestrained expansion of the subject to absolute spirit in Hegel is that, as moments inherent in this spirit, not only the subject but also the object are presented as substantial and making the full demands of their own beings. Hegel's much-admired material richness is itself a function of his speculative thought. It was his speculative thought that helped him to say something essential, not merely about the instruments of knowledge, but about its essential objects, without ever suspending consciousness's critical self-reflection. To the extent to which one can speak of realism in Hegel, it is to be found in the path followed by his idealism, It is not something heterogeneous to it. In Hegel, the tendency of idealism is to move beyond itself. Even the point of most extreme idealism, in Hegel's thought, the subject-object construction, should by no means be dismissed as the arrogance of the unrestrained concept. In Kant, the idea that a world divided into subject and object, the world in which, as prisoners of our own constitution, we are involved only with phenomena, is not the ultimate world, already forms the secret source of energy. Hegel adds an un-Kantian element to that, the idea that in grasping, conceptually, the block, the limit that is set to subjectivity, in understanding subjectivity as mere subjectivity, we have already passed beyond that limit. Hegel, who in many respects is a Kant come into his own, is driven by the idea that knowledge, if there is such a thing, is by its very idea total knowledge, that every one-sided judgment intends by its very form the absolute, and does not rest until it has been sublated in it. Speculative idealism does not recklessly disregard the limits of the possibility of knowledge. Rather, it searches for words to express the idea that a reference to truth as such is in fact inherent in all knowledge that is knowledge, that if it is to be knowledge at all and not a mere duplication of the subject, knowledge is more than merely subjective. It is objectivity, like the objective reason in Plato, the legacy of which chemically permeates subjective transcendental philosophy in Hegel. In proper Hegelian terms, one might say, at the same time, altering him in crucial respects through interpretation that subjects him to a further round of reflection, that it is precisely the construction of the absolute subject in Hegel that does justice to an objectivity indissoluble in subjectivity. Paradoxically, historically, only absolute idealism gives free rhyme to the method that the introduction to the phenomenology of spirit calls simply looking on, reines Zusehen. Hegel is able to think from the thing itself out, to surrender passively and as it were to its authentic substance, only because by virtue of the system, the matter at hand is referred to its identity with absolute subject. Things themselves speak in a philosophy that focuses its energies on proving that it is itself one with them. No matter how much Hegel the Fichten emphasizes the idea of positing, of generation through spirit, no matter how thoroughly active and practical his concept of development is, he is at the same time passive in his respect for the specific, comprehending which means nothing other than obeying its own concept. The notion of spontaneous receptivity plays a role in Husserl's phenomenology. This idea, too, is Hegelian through and through, except that in Hegel it is not limited to a specific type of active consciousness. It develops at all levels of both subjectivity and objectivity. Hegel everywhere yields to the object's own nature, which everywhere becomes something immediate for him again. But it is precisely this kind of subordination to the discipline of the thing itself that requires the most intense efforts on the part of the concept. Those efforts succeed at the moment in which the intentions of the subject are extinguished in the object. Hegel's critique strikes at the empty center of the static analysis of knowledge into subject and object that the currently accepted logic of science takes for granted, the residual theory of truth, according to which the objective is what is left after the so-called subjective factors have been eliminated. And the blow he strikes is so deadly because he does not set up an irrational unity of subject and object in opposition to that analysis, but instead preserves the distinct moments of the subjective and the objective, while grasping them as mediated by one another. The insight that in the realm of the so-called Geisteswissenschaften, human sciences, literally sciences of the spirit, wherever the object itself is mediated by spirit, knowledge becomes fruitful not by excluding the subject, but through its utmost exertions, through all its impulses and experiences. This insight, which self-reflection is now forcing upon the resistant social sciences, comes from Hegel's system. That insight makes his system scientifically superior to the institution of science and scholarship, which, while raging against the subject, regresses to a prescientific recording of mere unrelated facts, events, and opinions, a recording of what is most inadequately and contingently subjective. Although Hegel surrenders without reservation to the specificity of his object, actually to the objective dynamic of society, he is thoroughly immune, by virtue of his conception of the relationship between subject and object, which extends into all substantive knowledge, to the temptation to accept the facade uncritically. There are good reasons why the dialectic of essence and appearance is moved to the center of the logic. This needs to be remembered at a time when those who administer the dialectic in its materialist version, the official thought of the East Bloc, have debased it to an unreflected copy theory. Once divested of its critical ferment, the dialectic is as well suited to dogmatism as the immediacy of Schelling's intellectual intuition, against which Hegel's polemic was directed. Hegel helped Kant's critical philosophy come into its own by criticizing the Kantian dualism of form and content, by drawing the rigid determinations of difference of Kant, and in Hegel's interpretation, Fichte as well, into a dynamic without sacrificing the indissolubility of the moments to a flat, unmediated identity. For Hegel's idealism, reason becomes a critical reason in a sense that criticizes Kant once again, a negative reason that both preserves static elements and sets them in motion. The poles that Kant opposed to one another, form and content, nature and spirit, theory and praxis, freedom and necessity, the thing in itself and the phenomenon, are all permeated through and through by reflection in such a way that none of these determinations are left standing as ultimate. In order to be thought and to exist, each inherently requires the other that Kant opposed to it. Hence for Hegel, mediation is never a middle element between extremes, as since Kierkegaard a deadly misunderstanding has depicted it as being. Instead, mediation takes place in and through the extremes, in the extremes themselves. This is the radical aspect of Hegel, which is incompatible with any advocacy of moderation. Hegel shows that the fundamental ontological contents that traditional philosophy hoped to distill are not ideas discretely set off from one another. Rather, each of them requires its opposite, and the relationship of all of them to one another is one of process. But this alters the meaning of ontology so decisively that it seems futile to apply the word, as many contemporary interpreters of Hegel would like to do, to a so-called fundamental structure, whose very nature is not to be a fundamental structure, not to be upokaimenon or substratum. In Kant's sense, no world, no constitutum, is possible without the subjective conditions of reason, the constituents, and Hegel's self-reflection of idealism similarly adds that there can be no constituents and no generative conditions of the spirit that are not abstracted from actual subjects, and thereby ultimately from something that is not merely subjective, from the world. By virtue of this insistent response, the deadly legacy of traditional metaphysics, the question of an ultimate principle from which everything must be derivable, became meaningless for Hegel. Hence the dialectic, the epitome of Hegel's philosophy, cannot be likened to a methodological or ontological principle that would characterize his philosophy the way the doctrine of ideas characterizes Plato in his middle period, or the monadology characterizes Leibniz. The dialectic is neither a mere method by which spirit might elude the cogency of its object. In Hegel, the dialectic literally accomplishes the opposite, the permanent confrontation of the object with its concept. Nor is it a Weltanschauung into whose schema one has to squeeze reality. Just as the dialectic does not favor individual definitions, so there is no definition that fits it. Dialectic is the unswerving effort to conjoin reason's critical consciousness of itself and the critical experience of objects. The scientific concept of verification makes its home in that realm of separate, rigid concepts, such as those of theory and experience, on which Hegel declared war. If, however, one were to make precise inquiries into its own verification, then it is precisely Hegel's conception of the dialectic, which the ignorant tend to dismiss as a conceptual straitjacket, that the most recent phase of history has verified. And it has done so to an extent that passes judgment on any attempt to orient oneself in terms of what simply is the case, and to do without the alleged arbitrariness of the dialectical construction In terms of his own ideology, and as the henchman of more powerful interests, Hitler attempted to eradicate Bolshevism, whereas it was his war that brought the giant shadow of the Slavic world down on Europe. That same Slavic world of which Hegel had already made the ominous statement that it had not yet entered history. But it was not a prophetic historical gaze, something for which he would have had nothing but contempt, that enabled Hegel to say this. Rather, it was the constructive force that enters fully into what is, without sacrificing itself as reason, critique, and the awareness of possibility. For all that, however, and although the dialectic demonstrates the impossibility of reducing the world to a fixed subjective pole, and methodically pursues the reciprocal negation and production of the subjective and objective moments, Hegel's philosophy, a philosophy of spirit, held fast to idealism. Only the doctrine of the identity of subject and object inherent in idealism, an identity that amounts in terms of form to the primacy of the subject, gives it the strength of totality that performs the negative labor, the dissolution of individual concepts, the reflection of the immediate, and then the sublation of reflection. The most extreme formulations of this are to be found in Hegel's History of Philosophy. Not only is Fichtean philosophy the completion of Kantian philosophy, as Fichte himself had repeatedly asserted, but Hegel goes so far as to say, in addition to these, that is, Kant's and Fichte's systems of philosophies, and that of Schelling, there are none. Like Fichte, Hegel attempted to outdo Kant in idealism by dissolving anything not proper to consciousness, in other words, the given moment of reality, into a positing by the infinite subject. Hegel praised the greater consistency of Kant's successors in comparison with the abysmal discontinuities of the Kantian system, and he even outdid them in this regard. It did not occur to him that the Kantian discontinuities register the very moment of non-identity that is an indispensable part of his own conception of the philosophy of identity. Instead, he passes this judgment on Fichte. The shortcoming in the Kantian philosophy was its unthinking inconsistency, through which speculative unity was lacking to the whole system, and this shortcoming was removed by Fichte. Fichte's philosophy is thus the development of form in itself. Reason is in itself a synthesis of concept and actuality, and in particular a more consistent presentation of Kantian philosophy. His agreement with Fichte extends still farther. The Fichtean philosophy has the great advantage of having set forth the fact that philosophy must be a science derived from one supreme principle, from which all determinations are necessarily derived. The important point is this unity of principle and the attempt to develop from it in a scientifically consistent way the whole content of consciousness, or as has been said, to construct the whole world. There is little that could demonstrate Hegel's self-contradictory relationship to idealism, whose highest peak and whose turning point he attained, more incisively than these sentences. For the content of Hegel's philosophy is the notion that truth, which in Hegel means the system, cannot be expressed as a fundamental principle of this kind, an principle, but is the dynamic totality of all the propositions that can be generated from one another by virtue of their contradictions. But this is the exact opposite of Fichte's attempt to derive the world from pure identity, from absolute subject, from the one original positing. Despite this, however, Hegel considers the Fichtean postulate of the deductive system emphatically valid. It was only that he accorded its second principle much more weight than Fichte did in his science of knowledge. Matters do not rest with the absolute form, to use Hegel's language, that Fichte took up, and that is to enclose reality within it. Instead, concrete reality itself is something constructed through the process whereby thought grasps the opposition of content to form, and the opposing content, if you like, is developed out of the form itself. In his decision to tolerate no limits, to eliminate every particle of a determination of difference, Hegel literally ooded Fichtean idealism. The individual Fichtean principles thereby lose their conclusive significance. Hegel recognized the inadequacy of an abstract principle beyond the dialectic, a principle from which all else is to follow. Something that was implicit in Fichte but not yet developed now becomes the driving force of Hegel's philosophical activity. The consequence of the principle negates the principle itself and destroys its absolute primacy. Hence, in the Phenomenology, Hegel could start with the subject and grasp all concrete content in the contemplation of the subject's self-movement, while on the other hand, in the Logic, he could have the movement of thought begin with being. Correctly understood, the choice of a starting point, of what comes first, is a matter of indifference in Hegel's philosophy. His philosophy does not recognize a first something of this kind as a fixed principle that remains inalterable and identical with itself as thought progresses. With this, Hegel leaves all traditional metaphysics and the prospeculative notion of idealism as well far behind. Nevertheless, he does not abandon idealism. The absolute rigor and closed quality of the argument that he and Fichte strove for in opposition to Kant already establishes the priority of spirit, even if the subject is defined as object at every stage, just as conversely the object is defined as subject. When the contemplating spirit presumes to show that everything that exists is commensurable with spirit itself, with logos and the determinations of thought, spirit sets itself up as an ontological ultimate, even if at the same time it grasps the untruth in this, that of the abstract a priori, and attempts to do away with its own fundamental thesis. In the objectivity of the Hegelian dialectic, which quashes all mere subjectivism, there is something like a will on the part of the subject to jump over its own shadow. The Hegelian subject-object is subject. This illuminates something that, from the point of view of Hegel's own demand for complete consistency, is an unresolved contradiction. The fact that the subject-object dialectic, which involves no abstract higher-level concept, itself constitutes the whole, and yet is realized in turn as the life of absolute spirit. The quintessence of the conditioned, according to Hegel, is the unconditioned. It is this, not least of all, that gives rise to the hovering, suspended quality of Hegelian philosophy, its quality of being up in the air, its permanent scandalon. The name of the highest speculative concept, that of the absolute, of something utterly detached, is literally the name of that suspended quality. The Hegelian scandalon cannot be ascribed to any confusion or lack of clarity. Rather, it is the price Hegel has to pay for absolute consistency, which comes up against the limits of consistent thought, without being able to do away with them. Hegelian dialectic finds its ultimate truth, that of its own impossibility, in its unresolved and vulnerable quality, even if, as the theodicy of self-consciousness, it has no awareness of this. With this, however, Hegel renders himself vulnerable to the critique of idealism, an immanent criticism such as he required all criticism to be. He himself reached its threshold. Richard Kroner characterizes Hegel's relation to Fichte in words that in a certain sense already fit Fichte. Insofar as the I is opposed to all else through reflection, that extent it belongs instead to what it is opposed to what is posited, to the contents of thought, the moments of its activity. German idealism's response to this insight into the conditioned nature of the I, another of the insights that the philosophy of reflection, in its modern scientific form, has only laboriously regained, is roughly the Fichten distinction between the individual and the subject. In the last analysis, the Kantian distinction between the I as the substratum of empirical psychology and the transcendental I think. The finite subject is, as Husserl said of it, a part of the world. Itself tainted with relativity, it cannot be used to ground the absolute. It already presupposes, as the Kantian constitutum, that which is constituted, what transcendental philosophy is to explain. The I think, in contrast, pure identity, is taken to be pure in the emphatic Kantian sense, independent of all spatio-temporal facticity. Only in this way can everything that exists dissolve without remainder in its concept. In Kant, this step had not yet been taken, just as on the one hand the categorical forms of the I think need a supplementary content that does not arise out of them themselves in order to make truth, that is, knowledge of nature, possible? So, on the other hand, the I think itself and the categorical forms are respected by Kant as a species of givens. To this extent, at least, the critique of pure reason is more a phenomenology of subjectivity than a speculative system. In the Uns ideal lies that Kant, in his introspective naivete, continues to use unreflectively. He acknowledges the relationship, and not only in their application, but in their origin, of the categorical forms to something existing, namely human beings, that arises in turn from the interplay of the forms with sensory material. Kant's reflections broke off at this point, thereby bearing witness to the irreducibility of the empirical to spirit, the interweaving of the moments. Fichte was not content with this. He relentlessly drove the distinction between the transcendental and the empirical subject beyond Kant. And because of the irreconcilability of the two, he tried to extricate the principle of the I from facticity and thereby justify idealism in the absoluteness that then became the medium of the Hegelian system. Fichte's radicalism thereby revealed something that in Kant's was hidden in the twilight of transcendental phenomenology. But Fichte also thereby involuntarily revealed the dubious nature of his own absolute subject. He calls it something that all later idealists, and certainly the ontologists among them, were most careful to avoid calling it, an abstraction. Nevertheless, the pure I is to determine what it is abstracted from and what it itself is determined by, in that its very concept cannot be thought without such abstraction. What results from abstraction can never be made absolutely autonomous vis-a-vis what it is abstracted from, because the abstractum remains applicable to that which is subsumed within it, and because return is to be possible. The quality of what it has been abstracted from is always, in a certain sense, preserved in it at the same time, even if in an extremely general form. Hence, if the formation of the concept of the transcendental subject or the absolute spirit sets itself completely outside individual consciousness as something spatio-temporal, when in fact the concept is achieved through individual consciousness, then the concept itself can no longer be made good. Otherwise, that concept, which did away with all fetishes, becomes a fetish itself, and speculative philosophy, since Fichte has failed to see that. Fichte hypothesized the I that had been abstracted, and in this respect Hegel adhered to what he did. Both Fichte and Hegel skipped over the fact that the expression I, whether it is the pure transcendental I or the empirical, unmediated I, must necessarily designate some consciousness or other. Giving an anthropological materialist turn to this polemic, Schopenhauer had already insisted on that in his critique of Kant. At least in moral philosophy, he says, Kant's pure reason is taken, not as an intellectual faculty of man, though it is indeed nothing but this. On the contrary, it is hypothesized as something existing by itself, without any authority, and the deplorable philosophy of our times can serve as an illustration of the results of that most pernicious example and precedent. However, this laying down of morals, not for men as men, but for all rational beings as such, is something so near to his heart, such a favorite notion of his, that Kant is never tired of repeating it on every occasion. I say, on the contrary, that we are never entitled to set up a genus that is given to us only in a single species, for into the concept of that genus we could bring absolutely nothing but what we had taken from this one species, and thus what we stated about the genus could always be understood only of the one species. On the other hand, by thinking away without authority what belongs to this species in order to form the genus, we should perhaps remove the very condition of the possibility of the remaining attributes that are hypothesized as genus. But even in Hegel, the most emphatic expressions, such as spirit and self-consciousness, are derived from the finite subject's experience of itself, and trudly do not stem from linguistic sloppiness. Hegel, too, is unable to cut the tie binding absolute spirit to the empirical person. No matter how thoroughly the Fichtean or Hegelian absolute I, as an abstraction from the empirical I, may erase the latter's specific contents, if it were no longer at all what it was abstracted from, namely I, if it completely divested itself of the facticity contained in its concept. It would no longer be that being with itself of spirit, that homeland of knowledge from which the primacy of subjectivity in the great idealist systems depends. An I that was no longer I in any sense at all. An I, that is, without any relation to individuated consciousness and thereby to the spatio-temporal person, would be nonsense. It would not only be as free-floating and indeterminable as Hegel accused being, its counter-concept, of being. In addition, it could no longer be grasped as an I, as something mediated by consciousness. Analysis of the absolute subject has to acknowledge the indissolubility of an empirical, non-identical moment in it, a moment that doctrines of the absolute subject, idealist systems of identity, are not permitted to acknowledge as indissoluble. In this sense, Hegel's philosophy is untrue when measured against its own concept. In what sense is it then nevertheless true? To answer this question, one must elucidate something that dominates the whole of Hegel's philosophy without ever being made tangible. That is spirit. Spirit isn't placed in absolute contrast to something non-spiritual, something material. Originally, it is not a sphere of particular objects, those of the later Geisteswissenschaften. Rather, it is unqualified and absolute. Hence, in Hegel, as a legacy of Kant's practical reason, it is explicitly called free. According to the definition in the encyclopedia, however, it is essentially active, productive, just as Kant's practical reason is essentially distinguished from theoretical reason in creating its object, the deed. The Kantian moment of spontaneity, which is virtually equated with constitutive identity in the synthetic unity of apperception. Kant's concept of the I think was the formula for the lack of distinction between productive spontaneity and logical identity, becomes total in Hegel, and in this totality it becomes a principle of being no less than a principle of thought. But when Hegel no longer opposes production and deed to matter as subjective accomplishments, but rather looks for them in specific objects, in concrete material reality, he comes close to the mystery behind synthetic apperception and takes it out of the mere arbitrary hypostasis of the abstract concept. The mystery, however, is none other than social labor. In the economic and philosophical manuscripts of the young Marx, discovered in 1932, this was recognized for the first time. The outstanding achievement of Hegel's phenomenology, the dialectic of negativity as the moving and creating principle, is that he grasps the nature of labor and conceives objective man, true because real man, as the result of his own labor. The moment of universality in the active, transcendental subject, as opposed to the merely empirical, isolated, and contingent subject, is no more a fantasy than is the validity of logical propositions, as opposed to the empirical course of individual acts of thought. Rather, this universality is an expression of the social nature of labor, an expression both precise and concealed from itself for the sake of the general idealist thesis. Labor only becomes labor as something for something else, something commensurable with other things, something that transcends the contingency of the individual subject. Aristotle's Politics already tells us that the self-preservation of individual subjects depends as much on the labor of others as society depends on the deeds of individuals. The reference of the productive moment of spirit back to a universal subject rather than to an individual who labors is what defines labor as something organized, something social. Its own rationality, the ordering of functions, is a social relationship. Translating Hegel's concept of spirit into social labor elicits the reproach of a sociologism that confuses the genesis and influence of Hegel's philosophy with its substance. There is no question that Hegel was a transcendental analytic philosopher like Kant. One could show in detail how Hegel, as Kant's critics, sought to do justice to Kant's intentions by going beyond the critique of pure reason, just as Fichte's science of knowledge had pushed the limits of Kant's concept of the pure. The Hegelian categories, and especially the category of spirit, fall within the domain of transcendental constituents. But in Hegel, society, as the functional complex of empirical persons, would be what Kant calls a constitutum, a part of the existence that in Hegel's logic, in Hegel's doctrine of the absolutely unconditioned, and of existence as something that has come into being, is in turn developed out of the absolute that Hegel says is spirit. The interpretation of spirit as society, accordingly, appears to be a metabasis, eisalogenos, a shift to something of a different kind incompatible with the sense of Hegel's philosophy, if only because it does not satisfy the precept of immanent criticism and attempts to grasp the truth content of Hegelian philosophy in terms of something external to it, something that his philosophy within its own framework would have derived as conditioned or posited. Explicit critique of Hegel, of course, could show that he was not successful in that deduction. The linguistic expression existence, which is necessarily conceptual, is confused with what it designates, which is non-conceptual, something that cannot be melted down into identity. Immanently, Hegel cannot maintain the absoluteness of spirit, and his philosophy attests to that itself, at least insofar as it never finds the absolute except in the totality of disunity, in unity with its other. Conversely, however, society for its part is not mere existence, not mere fact. Only for a thought that works through external antitheses, a thought that is abstract in Hegel's sense, would the relationship of spirit and society be a transcendental logical relationship between constituents and constitutum. Society has allotted precisely what Hegel reserves for spirit, as opposed to all the isolated individual moments of empirical reality. Those moments are mediated by society, constituted the way things are constituted by spirit for an idealist, prior to any particular influence exerted by society on phenomena. Society is manifested in phenomena the way, for Hegel, essence is manifested in them. Society is essentially concept, just as spirit is. As the unity of human subjects who reproduce the life of the species through their labor, things come into being within society objectively, independent of reflection, without regard to the specific qualities of those who labor or the products of labor. The principle of the equivalence of social labor makes society in its modern bourgeois sense both something abstract and the most real thing of all, just what Hegel says of the emphatic notion of the concept. Hence every step thought takes comes up against society, and no step can pin it down as such, as one thing among other things. What permits Hegel the dialectician to preserve the concept of spirit from contamination with brute fact, and thereby to sublimate the brutality of the factual into spirit and legitimate it, is itself secondary. For the subject reflecting on it, the experience itself unconscious of abstract labor takes on magical form. For that subject, labor becomes its own reflected form, a pure deed of spirit, spirit's productive unity. For nothing is to be external to spirit, but the brute fact that disappears in the totalized notion of spirit returns in that notion as a logical compulsion. The individual fact can no more avoid it than the individual person can avoid the contrainte social. It is only this brutality of coercion that creates the semblance of reconciliation in the doctrine of an identity that has been produced. Even before Hegel, the expressions through which spirit was defined as original production in idealist systems were all, without exception, derived from the sphere of labor. No other expressions could be found, because in terms of its own meaning, what the transcendental synthesis was after could not be separated from its connection with labor. The systematically regulated activity of reason turns labor inward. The burdensomeness and coerciveness of outwardly directed labor has perpetuated itself in the reflective, modeling efforts that knowledge directs toward its object, efforts that are again required for the progressive domination of nature. Even the traditional distinction between sensibility and understanding, Sinnlichkeit and Verstand, indicates that in contrast to what is merely given by sensibility, without compensation, as it were, the understanding does something. What is given through the senses is simply there, like the fruits of the field. but the operations of the understanding are subject to volition, as that through which human beings form something that then confronts them. Those operations can occur or not occur. The primacy of logos has always been part of the work ethic. The stance adopted by thought as such, regardless of its content, is a confrontation with nature that has become habitual and has been internalized, an intervention and not a mere reception. Hence, talk about thought is always accompanied by talk about a material that thought knows to be distinct from itself, a material it processes the way labor processes its raw materials. For thought is always accompanied by the moment of violent exertion, a reflection of the dire necessities of life that characterizes labor. The strains and toils of the concept are not metaphorical. The Hegel of the phenomenology, in whom the consciousness of spirit as living activity and its identity with the real social subject was less atrophied than in the later Hegel, recognized the spontaneous spirit as labor, if not in theory, at least in his language. The path natural consciousness follows to the identity of absolute knowledge, Wissen, is itself labor. The relationship of spirit to what is given manifests itself on the model of a social process, a process of labor. Knowledge, in its first phase, or immediate spirit, is the non-spiritual, that is, sense consciousness. In order to become genuine knowledge, to beget the element of science, which is the pure notion of science itself, it must travel a long way and work its passage. This is by no means a figure of speech. If spirit is to be real, then its labor is certainly real. The Hegelian labor of the concept is not a loose circumlocution for the activity of the scholar. Hegel always represents the latter, as philosophy as passive, looking on as well, and for good reasons. The philosopher's labor actually aims solely at helping to express what is active in the material itself, what, as social labor, has an objective form that confronts human beings and yet remains the labor of human beings. The movement in which the unessential consciousness strives to attain this oneness, Hegel says in a later passage in the Phenomenology, is itself threefold in accordance with the threshold relation this consciousness will have with its incarnate beyond. First, as pure consciousness. Second, as a particular individual who approaches the actual world in the form of desire and work. And third, as consciousness that is aware of its own being for itself. Interpreters of Hegel have rightly insisted that each of the primary moments distinguished within his philosophy is at the same time the whole as well. But that is certainly also true of the concept of labor as a relationship to reality, for the dialectic as such, as a dialectic of the subject-object identity, is precisely such a relationship. The crucial connection between the concepts of desire and labor removes the latter from the position of a mere analogy to the abstract activity of abstract spirit. Labor in the full sense is in fact tied to desire, which it in turn negates. It satisfies the needs of human beings on all levels, helps them in their difficulties, reproduces human life, and demands sacrifices of them in return. Even in its intellectual form, labor provides a longer arm with which to procure the means of life. It is the principle of the domination of nature, which has become autonomous and thereby alienated from its knowledge of itself. But idealism becomes false when it mistakenly turns the totality of labor into something existing in itself, when it sublimates its principle into a metaphysical one, into the actus purus of spirit, and tendentially transfigures something produced by human beings, something fallible and conditioned, along with labor itself, which is the suffering of human beings, into something eternal and right. If one were permitted to speculate about Hegel's speculation, one might surmise that the extension of spirit to become totality is the inversion of the recognition that spirit is precisely not an isolated principle, not some self-sufficient substance, but rather a moment of social labor, the moment that is separate from physical labor. But physical labor is necessarily dependent on something other than itself, on nature. Labor, and in the last analysis its reflective form, spirit as well, cannot be conceived without the concept of nature. any more than can nature without labor. The two are distinct from and mediated by one another at the same time. Marx's critique of the Gotha program describes a state of affairs hidden deep within Hegel's philosophy, and does so all the more precisely in that it was not intended as a polemic against Hegel. Marx is discussing the familiar saying, labor is the source of all wealth and all culture, to which he counters, labor is not the source of all wealth. Nature is just as much the source of use values, and it is surely of such that material wealth consists, as labor, which itself is only the manifestation of a force of nature, human labor power. The above phrase is to be found in all children's primers and is correct insofar as it is implied that labor is performed with the appurtenant subjects and instruments. But a socialist program cannot allow such bourgeois phrases to pass over in silence the conditions that alone give them meaning. And insofar as man from the beginning behaves towards nature, the primary source of all instruments and subjects of labor, as an owner, treats her as belonging to him, his labor becomes the source of use values, therefore also of wealth. The bourgeois have very good grounds for falsely ascribing supernatural creative power to labor, since precisely from the fact that labor depends on nature, it follows that the man who possesses no other property than his labor power must, in all conditions of society and culture, be the slave of other men who have made themselves the owners of the material conditions of labor. But because of this, Hegel cannot afford to express the separation of mental and manual labor, and he does not read spirit as an isolated aspect of labor, but instead, conversely, dissolves labor into a moment of spirit. One might say he takes the rhetorical figure pars pro toto as his maxim. Detached from what is not identical with it, labor becomes ideology. Those who have at their disposal the labor of others ascribe to it inherent value, consider it absolute and primary, precisely because labor is only labor for others. The metaphysics of labor and the appropriation of the labor of others are complementary. This social relationship dictates the untruth in Hegel, the masking of the subject as subject-object, the denial of the non-identical in the totality, no matter how much the non-identical receives its due in the reflection of any particular judgment. Apart from the chapter on lordship and bondage, in the phenomenology of spirit, the nature of Hegel's productive spirit as labor appears, surprisingly, most graphically in the material on natural religion, at the third stage of which the spiritual becomes religious content for the first time, as a product of human labor. Spirit, therefore, here appears as an artificer, and its action whereby it produces itself as object but without having yet grasped the thought of itself, is an instinctive operation like the building of a honeycomb by bees. The crystals of pyramids and obelisks are the works of this artificer of rigid form. In not simply opposing fetish worship to religion as a primitive or degenerate stage, but instead defining it as a necessary moment in the formation of the religious spirit, and thereby, in the sense of the phenomenology's subject-object dialectic, as a necessary moment in the formation of religion itself, and ultimately of the absolute. Hegel includes human labor in its concrete material form among the essential characteristics of spirit as the absolute. Only a little more would be needed. Remembrance of the simultaneously mediated and irrevocably natural moment in labor, and the Hegelian dialectic would reveal its identity and speak its own name. With the separation of mental and manual labor, privilege reserves mental labor, which, despite all assertions to the contrary, is the easier for itself. But at the same time, manual labor always reappears in warning in the spiritual process, which is an imitation of physical action mediated by the imagination. Spirit can never get completely free of its relationship to the nature it is to dominate. Spirit obeys nature in order to master it. Even its proud sovereignty is purchased with suffering. The metaphysics of spirit, however, which makes spirit as labor unconscious of itself and absolute, is the affirmation of its entanglement, an attempt on the part of a self-reflective spirit to reinterpret the curse to which it submits as a blessing by passing it on, and thereby to justify it. In this regard especially, Hegel's philosophy can be accused of being ideological, in its exposition taken to the extreme of the bourgeois celebration of labour. It is precisely in this most elevated point of the idealist system, the absolute proclaimed ecstatically at the end of the phenomenology, that the sober, realistic features of Hegel take refuge. At the same time, even this deceptive identification of labour with the absolute had a valid basis. To the extent to which the world forms a system, it becomes one precisely through the closed universality of social labour. Social labour is in fact radical mediation, both between man and nature and also within spirit, which exists for itself, which tolerates nothing outside itself and forbids remembrance of anything outside it. There is nothing in the world that shall not manifest itself to human beings solely through social labour. Even where labour has no power over it, pure nature is defined through its relationship to labour, even if that relationship is a negative one. Only awareness of all that could lead the Hegelian dialectic beyond itself, and it is precisely this awareness that is forbidden to it. It would pronounce the name that holds it in its spell. Because nothing is known but what has passed through labour, labour rightly and wrongly becomes something absolute, and disaster becomes salvation. This is why the whole, which is the part, compulsively and unavoidably occupies the position of truth in the science of manifesting consciousness. For the absolutization of labour is that of the class relationship. A humankind free of labour would be free of domination. Spirit knows that without being permitted to know it. This is the poverty of philosophy. But the step by which labour sets itself up as the metaphysical principle, pure and simple, is none other than the consistent elimination of the material to which all labour feels itself tied. The material that defines its boundary for it, reminds it of what is below it, and relativizes its sovereignty. This is why epistemology juggles things until the given gives the illusion of having been produced by spirit. The fact that spirit too stands under the compulsion of labour and is itself labour is to disappear. The great classical philosophy literally passes the quintessence of coercion off as freedom. It gets refuted because the reduction of what exists to spirit cannot succeed, because that epistemological position, as Hegel himself knew, must be abandoned in the course of its own development. But it has its truth, in that no one is capable of stepping out of the world constituted by labour into another and unmediated one. The identification of spirit with labour can be criticized only in confronting the philosophical concept of spirit, with what that concept actually accomplishes, and not through recourse to something transcendent, however positive its nature. Spirit did not accomplish this. We know that in its emphatic Hegelian version, the concept of spirit is to be understood organically. The partial moments are to grow into and be interpenetrated by one another by virtue of a whole that is already inherent in every one of them. This concept of system implies the identity of subject and object, which has developed into the sole and conclusive absolute, and the truth of the system collapses when that identity collapses. But that identity, full reconciliation through spirit in a world which is in reality antagonistic, is a mere assertion. The philosophical anticipation of reconciliation is a trespass against real reconciliation. It describes anything that contradicts it to foul existence as unworthy of philosophy. But a seamless system and an achieved reconciliation are not one and the same. Rather, they are contradictory. The unity of the system derives from unreconcilable violence. Satanically, the world as grasped by the Hegelian system has only now, 150 years later, proved itself to be a system in the literal sense, namely that of a radically societalized society. One of the most remarkable aspects of Hegel's accomplishment is that he inferred that systematic character of society from the concept long before it could gain ascendancy in the sphere of Hegel's own experience, that of a Germany far behind in its bourgeois development. A world integrated through production, through the exchange relationship, depends in all its moments on the social conditions of its production, and in that sense actually realizes the primacy of the whole over its parts. In this regard, the desperate impotence of every single individual now verifies Hegel's extravagant conception of the system. Even the cult of production is more than the ideology of human beings who dominate nature and pursue their own interests without restraint. In that cult is sedimented the fact that the universal exchange relationship in which everything that exists only for something else, stands under the domination of those who hold social production at their disposal. This domination is worshipped philosophically. Even the being for something else that is the official justification for the existence of all commodities is only secondary to production. The very world in which nothing exists for its own sake is also the world of an unleashed production that forgets its human aims. The self-forgetfulness of production, the insatiable and destructive expansive principle of the exchange society, is reflected in Hegelian metaphysics. It describes the way the world actually is, not in historical perspective, but in essence, without creating any blue smoke in the process, with the question of authenticity. Civil society is an antagonistic totality. It survives only in and through its antagonisms and is not able to resolve them. In the work by Hegel that is most notorious for its restorationist tendencies, its apology for the status quo, and its cult of the state, the philosophy of right, that is stated bluntly. The very eccentricities and provocative passages that are responsible for the fact that important thinkers in the West like Veblen, Dewey, and even Santayana have lumped Hegel together with German imperialism and fascism should themselves be seen as derived from Hegel's consciousness of the antagonistic character of the totality. This is why Hegel's idealization of the state should not be trivialized by being treated as a mere empirical aberration or an irrelevant addendum. Rather, that idealization is itself produced by insight into the fact that the contradictions of civil society cannot be resolved by its self-movement. Passages like this one are critical. It hence becomes apparent that despite an excess of wealth, civil society is not rich enough. That is, its own resources are insufficient to check excessive poverty and the creation of a penurious rabble. This inner dialectic of civil society thus drives it, or at any rate drives a specific civil society, to push beyond its own limits and seek markets, and so its necessary means of subsistence, in other lands which are either deficient in the goods it has overproduced, or else generally backward in industry, etc. The free play of forces in capitalist society, whose liberal economic theory Hegel had accepted, has no antidote for the fact that poverty, pauperism, in Hegel's old-fashioned terminology, increases with social wealth. Still less could Hegel envision an increase in production that would make a mockery of the assertion that society is not rich enough in goods. The state is appealed to in desperation as a seat of authority beyond this play of forces. Paragraph 249 expressly refers to the extremely advanced passage just quoted. The beginning of that paragraph reads, "While the public authority must also undertake the higher directive function of providing for the interests which lead beyond the borders of its society," see paragraph 246, its primary purpose is to actualize and maintain the universal contained within the particularity of civil society, and its control takes the form of an external system and organization for the protection and security of particular ends and interests, en masse, inasmuch as these interests subsist only in this universal. It is intended to allay something that could not otherwise be smoothed over. Hegel's philosophy of the state is a necessary tour de force because it suspends the dialectic under the aegis of a principle to which Hegel's own critique of the abstract could be applied, a principle whose locus, as Hegel at least suggests, is by no means outside the play of social forces. Particular interests, which are common to everyone, fall within civil society and lie outside the absolutely universal interest of the state proper. See paragraph 256. The administration of these is in the hands of corporations. See paragraph 251. commercial and professional as well as municipal, and their officials, directors, managers, and the like. It is the business of the officials to manage the private property and interests of these particular spheres, and from that point of view, their authority rests on the confidence of their commonalties and professional equals. On the other hand, however, these circles of particular interests must be subordinated to the higher interests of the state, and hence the filling of positions of responsibility in corporations, etc., will generally be effected by a mixture of popular election by those interested with appointment and ratification by higher authority. But the tour de force was necessary because otherwise the dialectical principle would have extended beyond what exists and thereby negated the thesis of absolute identity, and it is only absolute in that it is realized. That is the core of Hegel's philosophy. Nowhere does that philosophy come closer to the truth about its own substratum, society, that where it turns into nonsense when confronted with it. Hegel's philosophy is indeed essentially negative. Critique. In extending the transcendental philosophy of the critique of pure reason through the thesis of reason's identity with what exists and making it a critique of what exists, a critique of any and every positivity, Hegel denounced the world, whose theodicy constitutes his program in its totality as well. He denounced it as a web of guilt, Schuldzusammenhang, in which, as Mephistopheles says in Faust, everything that exists deserves to perish. Even the false claim that the world is nonetheless a good world contains within it the legitimate demand that the empirical world become a good and a reconciled world, not merely in the idea that is its opposite, but in the flesh. If in the last analysis Hegel's system makes the transition into untruth by following its own logic, this is a judgment not simply on Hegel, as a self-righteous positivist science would like to think, but rather a judgment on reality. Hegel's scornful so much the worse for the facts is invoked against him so automatically only because it expresses the dead serious truth about the facts. Hegel did not simply reconstruct them in thought. He grasped them and criticized them by producing them in thought. Their negativity always makes them into something other than what they merely are and claim to be. The principle of reality's becoming, through which it is more than its positivity. That is, the central idealist motor of Hegel's thought is at the same time anti-idealist. It is the subject's critique of a reality that idealism equates with the absolute subject, namely consciousness of contradiction within the thing itself, and thereby the force of theory, a force with which the latter turns against itself. If Hegel's philosophy fails in terms of the highest criterion, its own, it thereby also proves itself true. The non-identity of the antagonistic, a non-identity it runs up against and laboriously pulls together, is the non-identity of a whole that is not the true but the untrue, the absolute opposite of justice. But in reality, this very non-identity has the form of identity, an all-inclusiveness that is not governed by any third, reconciling element. This kind of deluded identity is the essence of ideology, of socially necessary illusion. Only through the process whereby the contradiction becomes absolute, and not through the contradiction becoming alleviated in the absolute, could it disintegrate and perhaps find its way to that reconciliation that must have misled Hegel because its real possibility was still concealed from him. In all its particular moments, Hegel's philosophy is intended to be negative, but if, contrary to his intentions, it becomes negative as a whole as well, it thereby acknowledges the negativity of its object, in that ultimately the non-identity of subject and object, concept and thing, idea and society, emerges unpacifiable in his philosophy, in that it ultimately disintegrates in absolute negativity. It nevertheless also redeems its promise and truly becomes identical with its ensnared subject matter. In the last analysis, even in Hegel, the quiescence of movement, the absolute, means simply the reconciled life, the life of the pacified drive that no longer knows either deficiency or the labor to which alone, however, it owes that reconciliation. Hence, the locus of Hegel's truth is not outside the system. Rather, it is as inherent in the system as his untruth. For this untruth is none other than the untruth of the system of the society that constitutes the substratum of his philosophy. The objective turn that idealism took in Hegel, the restitution of the speculative metaphysics that had been shattered by Kant's critical philosophy, a restitution that restores concepts like that of being and that wants to salvage even the ontological proof of God. All of this has encouraged people to claim Hegel for existential ontology. Heidegger's interpretation of the introduction to the Phenomenology in Holzwege is the most well-known, if by no means the first testimony to that. From this claim one can learn something that existential ontology is currently reluctant to hear. Existential ontology's affinity with transcendental idealism, something it imagines it has overcome through the pathos of being. But while what now goes under the name of the question of being has a place as a moment in Hegel's system, Hegel denies being the very absoluteness, the very priority over all thought or concept, that the most recent resurrection of metaphysics hopes to secure. By virtue of its definition of being as an essentially negative, reflected, criticized moment of the dialectic, Hegel's theory of being becomes incompatible with the contemporary theologization of being. Scarcely anywhere does his philosophy have more contemporary relevance than where it dismantles the concept of being. Even the definition of being at the beginning of the Phenomenology says the precise opposite of what the word is intended to suggest today. Further, the living substance is being which is in truth subject, or, what is the same, is in truth actual only insofar as it is the movement of positing itself, or is the mediation of its self-othering with itself. The distinction between being as subject and the being, sein, written with the Y that for Hegel was still orthographic but today is archaic, is the distinction that makes all the difference. In contrast to taking subjective consciousness as a point of departure, Hegel's logic, as we know, develops the categories of thought itself from one another in their objectivity, and in doing so begins with the concept of being. This beginning, however, does not found any prima philosophia. Hegel's being is the opposite of a primordial entity. Hegel does not credit the concept of being as a primordial value with immediacy, the illusion that being is logically and genetically prior to any reflection, any division between subject and object. Instead, he eradicates immediacy. Being, he says at the beginning of the section of the logic for which the word being serves as the title, is indeterminate immediacy, and because of its indeterminateness, this very immediacy to which existential ontology clings becomes for Hegel, who understood the mediatedness of everything unmediated, an objection to the dignity of being. It is being's negativity, pure and simple, that motivates the dialectical step that equates being with nothingness. In its indeterminate immediacy, it is equal only to itself. It is pure indeterminateness and emptiness. There is nothing to be intuited in it, if one can speak here of intuiting, or it is only pure intuiting itself. Just as little is anything to be thought in it, or it is equally only this empty thinking. Being, the indeterminate immediate, is in fact nothing, and neither more or less than nothing. This emptiness, however, is not so much an ontological quality of being as a deficiency in the philosophical idea that terminates in being. If we enunciate being as a predicate of the absolute, writes Hegel at his most mature, in the Encyclopedia, we get the first definition of the latter. The absolute is being. This is, in thought, the absolutely initial definition, the most abstract and stinted. The concept of being, the ultimate legacy of Husserl's originary intuition, is currently being celebrated as something removed from all reification, as absolute immediacy. Hegel not only saw that it is incapable of being grasped intuitively because of that indeterminateness and emptiness. He also saw that it is a concept that forgets it is a concept and masquerades as pure immediacy. In a certain sense, it is the most thing-like concept of all. When being is taken in this simplicity and immediacy, the recollection that it is the result of complete abstraction, and so for that reason alone is abstract negativity, nothing is left behind. He writes at a somewhat later point in the Logic, but one can see from statements in the Logic directed specifically against Jacobi that Hegel is not engaging in sublime play with words here. Rather, the critique of being is in fact intended as a critique of any and every emphatic use of this concept in philosophy. With this wholly abstract purity of continuity, that is, indeterminateness and vacuity of conception, it is indifferent whether this abstraction is called space, pure intuiting, or pure thinking. It is altogether the same as what the Indian calls Brahma, when for years on end, physically motionless and equally unmoved in sensation, conception, fantasy, desire, and so on, looking only at the tip of his nose, he says inwardly only Om, 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 or else nothing at all. This dull, empty consciousness, understood as consciousness, is being. Hegel heard the evocation of being in its manic rigidity as the formulaic clattering of the prayer wheel. He knew something that has currently been falsified and lost, for all the talk of the concrete, lost precisely in the magic of the undefined concreteness that has no substance but its own aura. That philosophy is not permitted to look for its subject matter in the most supreme universal concepts, which are then ashamed of their own universal conceptual character, for the sake of their presumed eternity and immutability. Like only the Nietzsche at the twilight of the idols after him, Hegel rejected the equation of philosophical substance, truth, with the highest abstractions, and located truth in the very specificities with which traditional metaphysics was too refined to dirty its hands. In Hegel, idealism transcends itself, not least of all in this intention, which he carries out magnificently in the close linking of stages of consciousness with socio-historical stages in the phenomenology of spirit. What currently claims to rise above dialectics as an evocation of words, as sage now more than ever falls prey to the dialectic. It is abstraction, which inflates itself into a something that exists in and for itself, and in so doing sinks down into something utterly without content, into tautology, into being that says nothing about being, over and over again. Since Husserl, contemporary philosophies of being have revolted against idealism. To this extent, the irrevocable situation of historical consciousness is expressed in them. They register the fact that what is cannot be developed or deduced from mere subjective immanence, from consciousness, but they thereby hypothesize the supreme result of subjective conceptual abstraction, being, and thus, both in terms of their stance on society and in their theoretical approach, they are trapped within idealism without being aware of it. There is nothing that demonstrates this more strikingly than the speculations of the arch-idealist Hegel. As we see already in Heidegger's early work on a work attributed to Duns Scotus, those who want to restore ontology feel themselves largely in agreement with Hegel, namely with respect to an overall conception of Western metaphysics that they hope to get free of later, and in fact in Hegel the extremes of idealism do indeed transcend mere subjectivity, the delusory sphere of philosophical immanence. To apply an expression of Emile Last to something more general, in Hegel too, idealism's intention points beyond itself, but behind this formal consonance with the ontological impulse are hidden differences whose subtlety makes all the difference in the world. The idea, which in Hegel is actually directed against traditional idealism, is not the idea of being, but the idea of truth. That the form of thought is the perfect form, and that it presents the truth as it intrinsically and actually is the general dogma of philosophy. The absoluteness of spirit, as opposed to anything merely finite, is intended to vouch for the absoluteness of truth, which is removed from mere opining, from all intention, from all subjective facts of consciousness. This is the apex of Hegel's philosophy. For him, truth is not a mere relationship between judgment and objects, not a predicate of subjective thought. Rather, it is intended to rise substantially above that, indeed as something in and for itself, Knowing truth is for him nothing less than knowing the absolute. This is the intent of his critique of Kant's critical philosophy, with its delimitations and its irreconcilable separation of subjectivity and being in itself. In a passage cited by Kroner, Hegel says that Kant's so-called critical philosophy has soothed the conscience of ignorance of the eternal and divine by having proved that nothing can be known of the eternal and divine. Nothing is more welcome to superficiality of knowledge and character. Nothing seized upon more readily than this doctrine of ignorance, in which this superficiality and shallowness is presented as excellence, as the aim and result of all intellectual endeavor. This kind of emphatic idea of truth gives the lie to subjectivism, whose assiduous concern with whether truth is true enough terminates in the abolition of truth. The content of consciousness that develops into truth is not truth merely for the knowing subject, whether that subject be a transcendental one or not. The idea of the objectivity of truth strengthens the subject's reason. It is to be possible, attainable for him. Current attempts to break out of subjectivism, in contrast, are allied to a deformation of the subject. As an idea of reason, however, Hegel's idea is distinguished from the restoration of the absolute concept of being by being mediated within itself. For Hegel, truth in itself is not being. It is precisely in being that abstraction. The approach of the subject that produces its concepts nominalistically is hidden. In Hegel's idea of truth, however, the subjective moment, the moment of relativity, is surpassed in that it becomes aware of itself. The idea is contained in what is true, although it is not identical with it. Reason is therefore misunderstood when reflection is excluded from the true, and is not grasped as a positive moment of the absolute. Perhaps nothing says more about the nature of dialectical thought than that self-consciousness of the subjective moment in truth. Reflection on reflection is to effect a reconciliation with the injustice that the operating subjectivity does to immanent truth in merely supposing and positing as true something that is never wholly true. If the idealist dialectic turns against idealism, it does so because its own principle, because the very overextension of its idealist claim is at the same time anti-idealist. The dialectic is a process in terms of the immanence of truth, as much as in terms of the activity of consciousness. Process, that is truth itself. Hegel emphasizes this in one formulation after another. Truth is its own self-movement, whereas the method just described is the mode of cognition that remains external to its material. This movement is elicited by the subject in the activity of thinking. In my view, everything turns on grasping and expressing the true, not only as substance, but equally as subject. But because the material that every individual judgment is concerned with is confronted with its concept in that judgment, and because every individual finite judgment disintegrates as untrue in that process, the subjective activity of reflection leads truth out beyond the traditional concept of the adaptation of the idea to its subject matter. Truth can no longer be apprehended as a quality characterizing judgments. In Hegel, truth is called, as in the traditional definition yet in secret opposition to it, agreement of the concept with its actuality. It consists in the coincidence of the object with itself, that is, with its concept. Because, however, no finite judgment ever attains that agreement, the concept of truth is torn loose from predicative logic and transposed into the dialectic as a whole. It is necessary, says Hegel, to discard the prejudice that truth must be something tangible. Hegel's critique of the rigid separation of the moments of the judgment fuses truth, insofar as it is conceived as mere result, with process. It destroys the illusion that truth could consist in consciousness's measuring itself in terms of some individual thing confronting it. True and false belong among those determinate notions which are held to be inert and wholly separate essences, one here and one there, each standing fixed and isolated from the other, with which it has nothing in common. Against this view, it must be maintained that truth is not a minted coin that can be given and pocketed ready-made. nor is there such a thing as the false, any more than there is something evil. To know something falsely means that there is a disparity between knowledge and its substance. But this very disparity is the process of distinguishing in general, which is an essential moment in knowing. Out of this distinguishing, of course, comes their identity, and this resultant identity is the truth. But it is not truth as if the disparity had been thrown away, like dross from pure metal, not even like the tool which remains separate from the finished vessel. Disparity, rather, as the negative, the self, is itself still directly present in the true as such. Hegel breaks here with the doctrine of truth as an adequatio re atque cogitationis, a doctrine parroted by the whole of philosophy. Through the dialectic, which is the approach of a consistent nominalism, awakened to self-consciousness, an approach that examines any and every concept in terms of its subject matter, and in doing so convicts it of its inadequacy, a Platonic idea of truth is adumbrated. This idea is not asserted as something obvious and directly present to the intuition. Instead, it is aroused in anticipation by the very insistence of intellectual labor, which customarily stops with the critique of Platonism. Philosophical reason, too, has its cunning. Only when the demand for truth refuses to honor the nevertheless inescapable claim to truth made in each and every limited and therefore untrue judgment, a claim that at the same time cannot be dispensed with, only when it negates the subjective adequatio through self-reflection, does truth make the transition of its own accord into an objective idea, an idea that is no longer nominalistically reducible. Hegel also always interprets the movement that is supposed to be truth as self-movement, Eigenbewegung, that is motivated as much by the state of affairs with which the judgment is concerned as by the synthesis effected by thought, that the subject may not simply content itself with the mere adequacy of its judgments to the states of affairs judged derives from the fact that judgment is not a mere subjective activity, that truth itself is not a mere quality of judgment. Rather, in truth, something always prevails that, although it cannot be isolated, cannot be reduced to the subject, something that traditional idealist epistemologies believe they can neglect as a mere unknown. Truth divests itself of its subjectivity, because no subjective judgment can be true, and yet each and every one must want to be true. Truth transcends itself and becomes something in itself. As something that makes the transition in this way, however, something that is not merely posited any more than it is something merely revealed, truth is also incompatible with what ontology hopes to discover through its inquiries. Hegel's truth is no longer in time, as nominalist truth was, nor is it above time in the ontological fashion. For Hegel, time becomes a moment of truth itself. Truth as process is a passage through all moments, as opposed to a proposition that contains contradictions, and as such it has a temporal core. This liquidates the hypostasis of abstraction and the self-identical concept that dominates traditional philosophy. If Hegel's movement of the concept restores Platonism in a certain sense, this Platonism is nevertheless healed of its static quality, its mythic heritage, and has absorbed into itself all the spontaneity of liberated consciousness. Despite everything, Hegel ultimately remains tied to the identity thesis and therefore to idealism, but at a moment in the history of spirit when conformity changed spirit in a way that was not the case 100 years ago, the now cheap critique of idealism that at that time had to be won from the superior power of idealism needs to be reminded that there is a moment of truth in the identity thesis itself. If in Kantian terms there were no similarity between subject and object, if the two, as an unrestrained positivism would have it, stood in absolute and unmediated opposition to one another, then not only would there be no truth, there would be no reason and no ideas at all. Thought that completely extirpated its mimetic impulse, the kind of enlightenment that does not carry out the self-reflection that forms the content of the Hegelian system, naming the relationship of the matter at hand to the idea, would end up in madness, thought that is absolutely without reference, the complete opposite of the philosophy of identity, thought that removes all participation on the subject's part and all anthropomorphism from the object is the consciousness of the schizophrenic. Its objectivity celebrates its triumph in a pathos-filled narcissism. The speculative Hegelian concept rescues mimesis through spirit self-reflection. Truth is not a daequatio but affinity, and in the decline of idealism, reason's mindfulness of its mimetic nature is revealed by Hegel to be its human right. Here one could object that in hypostatizing spirit, Hegel, the Platonic realist and absolute idealist, indulged in the same conceptual fetishism that occurs in the name of being today. But a judgment that invoked this similarity would itself remain abstract. Even if abstract thought and abstract being are the same, as an admittedly disputed line from a poem by Parmenides claimed at the beginning of Western philosophy, the ontological concept of being has a different status than the Hegelian concept of reason. Both categories participate in the dynamic of history. Some people, Kroner included, who have tried to list Hegel among the irrationalists on the basis of his critique of finite and limited reflection. And there are statements by Hegel that can be adduced to support that argument, such as his statement that speculation, like unmediated belief, stands opposed to reflection. But like Kant in the three critiques, Hegel maintains decisively that reason is one, that it is reason, ratio, thought. Even the movement that is to lead out beyond all finite conceptual determinations is a self-critical movement on the part of thought. The speculative concept is neither intuition nor categorical intuition. The rigor of Hegel's attempt to rescue the ontological proof of God in opposition to Kant may be questioned, but what impelled him to it was not a desire to eclipse reason, but on the contrary the utopian hope that the block, the limits of the possibility of experience, might not be final, that success might be achieved anyway, as in the concluding scene of Faust, that spirit in all its weakness, limitations and negativity resembles truth and is therefore suited for knowledge of truth. If at one time the arrogance of the Hegelian doctrine of absolute spirit was rightly emphasized, today, when idealism is defamed by everyone and most of all by the secret idealists, a wholesome corrective becomes apparent in the notion of spirit's absoluteness. It passes judgment on the paralyzing resignation in contemporary consciousness, which, out of its own weakness, is ever ready to support the degradation done to it by the superior force of blind existence. In the so-called ontological proof of the existence of God, we have the same conversion of the absolute concept into existence. This conversion has constituted the depth of the idea in the modern world, although recently it has been declared inconceivable, with the result that knowledge of truth has been renounced, since truth is simply the unity of concept and existence. If Hegelian reason resists being merely subjective and negative, and repeatedly functions as spokesperson for what is opposed to this subjective reason, even unearthing the rationale in the irrational with gusto. Hegel does not simply compel the obedience of one who would rebel against this by making the heteronymous and estranged appetizing, as though it were reason's natural subject matter, nor does he merely warn that it is no use opposing what cannot be changed. Rather, in his innermost core, Hegel sensed that the nature and destiny of human beings can be realized only through what is estranged, only through the world's domination, as it were, of human beings. Human beings must appropriate even the powers that are hostile to them. They must insinuate themselves into them, so to speak. Hegel introduced the cunning of reason into the philosophy of history in order to provide a plausible demonstration of the way objective reason, the realization of freedom, succeeds by means of the blind, irrational passions of historical individuals. This concept reveals something about the experiential core of Hegel's thought. His thought, as a whole, is cunning. It hopes to achieve victory over the superior power of the world, about which it has no illusions, by turning this superior power against itself until it turns into something different. In a conversation with Goethe handed down by Eckermann, in which he was unusually candid, Hegel defined the dialectic as the organized spirit of contradiction. That kind of cunning is not an insubstantial element in the dialectic, a kind of grandiose peasant shrewdness that has learned to submit to the powerful and adapt to their needs, until it can wrest their power from them. The dialectic of lordship and bondage lets that secret out. We know that throughout his life Hegel held to the Swabian dialect, even as an ostensible Prussian state philosopher, and reports about him repeatedly note with amazement the surprising simplicity of the character of this man who was so exceptionally difficult as a writer. He remained unfalteringly faithful to his origins, the precondition for a strong ego and any elevation of thought. Of course, there is a residue of false positivity in this. Hegel focuses on the circumstances in which he finds himself, like the person who believes he will reaffirm his value by letting one know, through gestures or words, that he is an unimportant man. But that naivete of the unnaive, whose analogue in the system is the restoration of immediacy at all its levels, itself testifies to an ingenious craftiness, especially in contrast to the stupid, perfidious reproach of artificiality and exaggeration that has been blabbered against every dialectical idea since then, in the naivete of the idea that is so close to its object that it is on intimate terms with it, as it were. The otherwise so grown-up Hegel preserved, as Horkheimer said, an element of childhood, the courage to be weak that gives the child the idea that it will ultimately overcome even what is most difficult. In this regard, too, of course, Hegel's philosophy, perhaps more dialectical than it itself imagined, walks a narrow line. For as little as it is willing to renounce knowledge of truth, its tendency to resignation is undeniable. It would like to justify what exists as rational and dispense with the reflection that opposes this, with a superior attitude that boasts about how difficult the world is and draws the moral that it cannot be changed. If anywhere, it is here that Hegel was bourgeois, but to sit in judgment on him even in this regard would be a sign of a servile attitude, the most questionable and therefore also the best known of Hegel's teachings, that what is real is rational, was not merely apologetic. Rather, in Hegel, reason finds itself constellated with freedom. Freedom and reason are nonsense without one another. The real can be considered rational only insofar as the idea of freedom, that is, human beings' genuine self-determination, shines through it. Anyone who tries to conjure away this legacy of the Enlightenment in Hegel and campaign for the idea that his logic has nothing to do with the rational ordering of the world falsifies him. Even where, in his later period, Hegel defends the positive, that which simply is, that he attacked in his youth, he appeals to reason, which understands what merely exists as more than merely existing, understands it from the point of view of self-consciousness and the self-emancipation of human beings. One cannot remove the objective concept of reason from absolute idealism any more than one can remove its subjective origins in the self-preserving reason of the individual. Even in Kant's philosophy of history, self-preservation turns, by virtue of its own movement, into objectivity, into humanity, into a true society. This alone enabled Hegel to define subjective reason, a necessary moment in absolute spirit, as something universal as well. Even if it does not know it, the reason of the individual, with which in the dialectic of sense certainty Hegel's movement of the concept begins, is always already potentially the reason of the species. This much is true even in the otherwise false doctrine of the idealist that sets up transcendental consciousness, which is an abstraction from individual consciousness, as substantial and immanent, despite its genetic and logical dependence on individual consciousness. The Janus character of Hegel's philosophy becomes particularly obvious in the category of the individual. Hegel sees through the moment of illusion in individuation, as well as his antipode Schopenhauer does, the obstinacy of dwelling on what one merely is oneself, the narrowness and particularity of individual interests. Nevertheless, Hegel did not dispossess objectivity or essence of their relationship to the individual and the immediate. The universal is always also the particular, and the particular the universal. By analyzing this relationship, the dialectic gives an account of the social force field in which everything individual is socially preformed from the outset, and at the same time, nothing is realized except in and through individuals. The categories of the particular and the general, the individual and society, cannot be put to rest any more than can those of subject and object. nor can the process that takes place between them be interpreted as a process between two poles that retain their individual identities. The contributions of the two moments, indeed what those moments actually are, can be discerned only in historical concretion. If nevertheless in the construction of Hegelian philosophy, the universal, the substantial, as opposed to the frailty and weakness of the individual, and ultimately the institutional, are most strongly accentuated. This expresses more than a complicity with the course of the world, more than the cheap consolation for the fragility of existence that reminds it that it simply is fragile. While Hegel's philosophy draws the full consequences from bourgeois subjectivism, that is, it actually understands the world as a whole, as the product of labor. As commodity, if one will, at the same time, Hegel gives an extremely sharp critique of subjectivity, one that goes far beyond Fichte's distinction between the subject and the individual. In Hegel, the not I, which in Fichte was abstractly posited, is developed, subjected to the dialectic, concretely, and hence not only in general terms but in its full specific content, thus serving to delimit the subject. Whereas Heine, surely not the least judicious of Hegel's listeners, could understand Hegel's teachings primarily as a validation of individuality. Individuality itself finds itself dealt with roughly, even with contempt, at numerous levels of the system. But this reflects the ambiguity of civil society, which truly attains self-consciousness in Hegel when it comes to individuality. To civil society, the human being, as unrestrained producer, appears to be autonomous, heir of the divine legislator, virtually omnipotent. For this reason, however, the particular individual who in this society is truly a mere agent of the social process of production, and whose own needs are merely ground down, so to speak, in the process, is also considered completely impotent and insignificant at the same time. In unresolved opposition to the pathos of humanism, Hegel explicitly and implicitly orders human beings, as those who perform socially necessary labor, to subject themselves to an alien necessity. He thereby embodies, in theoretical form, the antinomy of the universal and the particular in bourgeois society. But by formulating it ruthlessly, he makes this antinomy more intelligible than ever before and criticizes it even as he defends it. Because freedom would be the freedom of real, particular individuals, Hegel disdains the illusion of freedom, the individual who, in the midst of universal unfreedom, behaves as though he were already free and universal. Hegel's confidence that theoretical reason can still achieve its goals amounts to the knowledge that reason has a hope of realizing itself, of becoming a rational reality, only if it indicates the pivotal point from which one can dislodge the age-old burden of myth. The burden is mere existence, which in the last analysis entrenches itself in the individual. Its pivot point is reason, as the reason of existence itself. Hegel's apologetics and his resignation are the bourgeois mask that utopia has put on to avoid being immediately recognized and apprehended, to avoid remaining impotent. How little Hegel's philosophy can be reduced to bourgeois civility is perhaps most obvious in his stance on morality. It is a moment in his critique of the category of individuality as such. He was probably the first to express in the Phenomenology the idea that the rift between self and world passes in turn through the self, that it continues, as Kroner says, on into the individual and divides him in accordance with the objective and subjective rationality of his will and his deeds. Hegel knew early on that the individual himself is both something socially functioning, something defined by the matter at hand, namely by his labor, and also something that exists for itself, with specific inclinations, interests, and talents, and that these two moments point in different directions. But the purely moral action in which the individual thinks he is himself and only himself, acting autonomously, thereby becomes ambiguous, a self-deception. Modern analytical psychology's recognition that what the individual human being thinks about himself is illusory and to a large extent mere rationalization has provided a home for one piece of Hegelian speculation. Hegel derived the transition from pure moral self-consciousness to hypocrisy, which then became the focus of Nietzsche's critical attack on philosophy, from its moment of objective untruth. Historically, of course, formulations like the one in the Phenomenology about the hard heart that insists on the purity of the moral commandment still fall within the context of the post-Kantian Schillerian critique of rigorous Kantian ethics, but at the same time, they represent a prelude to Nietzsche's notion of ressentiment, of morality as revenge. Hegel's statement that there is nothing morally real is not a mere moment in the transition to his notion of concrete ethical life, Sittlichkeit. In it, the recognition that the moral can by no means be taken for granted, that conscience does not guarantee right action, and that pure immersion of the self in the question of what to do and what not to do entangles one in contradiction and futility. Hegel takes an impulse of the radical Enlightenment farther. He does not oppose the good to empirical life as an abstract principle, a self-sufficient idea, but instead links it through its own content to the production of a true totality, to precisely what appears under the name of humanity in the critique of practical reason. Hegel thereby transcends the bourgeois separation of ethos as something that, although unconditionally binding, is valid only for the subject, from the objectivity of society, which is ostensibly merely empirical. This is one of the most remarkable perspectives provided by Hegel's mediation of the a priori and the a posteriori. The incisiveness of his formulation takes us by surprise. The designation of an individual as immoral necessarily falls away when morality in general is imperfect, and has therefore only an arbitrary basis. Therefore, the sense and content of the judgment of experience is solely this, that happiness simply as such should not have been the lot of some individuals, that is, that judgment is an expression of envy which covers itself with the cloak of morality. The reason, however, why so-called good luck should fall to the lot of others is good friendship, which grants and wishes them, and itself too, this lucky chance. No mere bourgeois would have talked this way. The bourgeois glorification of what exists is always accompanied by the delusion that the individual, that which exists purely for itself, which is how the subject necessarily appears to himself in the existing order, is capable of the good. Hegel destroyed this illusion. His critique of morality cannot be reconciled with that apology for society, which needs a moral ideology of the individual and his renunciation of happiness to sustain itself in its own injustice. Once one has seen through the cliché of Hegel's bourgeois civility, one will no longer succumb to the suggestion made by Schopenhauer and then Kierkegaard, who dismiss Hegel as a person as conformist and insignificant, and derive their negative verdict on his philosophy, not least from that. To Hegel's credit, he was not an existential thinker in the sense that was inaugurated by Kierkegaard and has now degenerated to a self-satisfied cliché. The fact that the most recent and already threadbare version of the cult of personality does not fit him does not degrade Hegel to the comfortable professor, lecturing unconcerned on the sufferings of mankind. The picture with which Kierkegaard and Schopenhauer so successfully defamed him to posterity. In fact, Schopenhauer showed infinitely less humanity and generosity to Hegel than the older man had shown him. Hegel granted Schopenhauer his habilitation despite the fact that Schopenhauer, in a foolish debate, had arrogantly played himself off against Hegel as a high-principled researcher who was expert in the natural sciences. Hegel's critique had gone beyond the notion of existence that opposed him long before existence. Man, the philosopher, and his authenticity had begun to give itself airs and then become established in academia as well. Just as the empirical person who thinks lags behind the power and objectivity of the idea, he thinks whenever the idea is an idea. An idea's claim to truth does not lie in its adequacy, as an illustration of the thinker in the paltry repetition of what he is anyway, but rather, this claim is proven in that which goes beyond entanglement in mere existence, in that in which the individual human being divests himself of himself so that he may finally reach his goal. Hegel's demeanor full of suffering, his countenance ravaged by thought, the face of one who has literally consumed himself until he is no more than ashes, bear witness to this self-divestiture. Hegel's bourgeois unpretentiousness worked to the benefit of his immeasurable efforts, inscribed with their own impossibility to think the unconditioned, an impossibility that Hegel's philosophy reflects within itself as the epitome of negativity. In the face of that, the appeal to authenticity, risk, and the boundary situation is a modest one. If there is truly a need for the thinking subject in philosophy, if there can be no insight into the objectivity of the matter at hand without the element currently dealt with under the trademark of the existential, that moment achieves legitimacy, not in showing off, but in shattering that self-positing through the discipline imposed on it by the thing itself and extinguishing itself within it. Hegel is almost without peer in following this path. But as soon as the existential moment asserts itself to be the basis of truth, it becomes a lie. Hegel's hatred of those who ascribe the right of full truth to the immediacy of their experience is directed to this lie as well. The wealth of experience on which thought feeds in Hegel is incomparable. It is put into the ideas themselves, never appearing as mere material. To say nothing of example or evidence external to the ideas. Through what is experienced, the abstract idea is transformed back into something living, just as mere material is transformed through the path thought travels. One could show this in every sentence of the phenomenology of spirit. Hegel was in fact granted something praised, usually without justification in artists: sublimation. He truly possessed life in its colored reflection, in its recapitulation in spirit. But under no circumstances should one conceive sublimation in Hegel as equivalent to internalization. Hegel's conception of self-divestiture, like the critique of a vain and deluded subjectivity existing for itself, a critique he shares with Goethe and which moves out beyond idealism, is the opposite of internalization. And as a person, Hegel shows hardly a trace of it. Like the subject of his theories, the man Hegel had absorbed both subject and object into himself in spirit. The life of his spirit is all of life again within itself. Hence Hegel's withdrawal from life should not be confused with the ideology of scholarly renunciation. As sublimated spirit, Hegel the person resounds with the outward and the physical the way great music does. Hegel's philosophy murmurs and rustles. As with his devoted critic Kierkegaard, one could speak of an intellectual body in him. His bride, the Baroness Maria von Tucher, took it amiss when he added these words to a letter she had written to his sister. "From this you can see how happy I can be with her for all the rest of my life, and how happy the attainment of such love, for which I scarcely had any hope left in this world, is making me even now, insofar as happiness is part of the destiny of my life." The whole anti-private Hegel is in these private words. Later, in Zarathustra, the thought in them was given a poeticized form. Trachte ich denn nach Glück, ich trachte nach meinem Werke. Do I covet happiness? I covet my work. But the almost tradesman-like dryness and sobriety to which the most extreme pathos shrivels in Hegel gives the idea a dignity it loses when it provides its pathos with a fanfare. The meaning of Hegel's life is tied to the substance of his philosophy. No philosophy was so profoundly rich. None held so unswervingly to the experience to which it had entrusted itself without reservation. Even the marks of its failure were struck by truth itself. Page 7. The experiential content of Hegel's philosophy. I will be dealing here with some